Hello, tired and curious minds. Welcome to another episode of historical misfortune. This is Ned, your reluctant guide through humanity's most uncomfortable eras. So, find that perfect spot on your couch or in your bed, dim the lights, and take a deep breath. Forget about your 21st century problems for a moment. I guarantee the problems of the past were much worse and, thankfully, are no longer yours. Let's get on with another screw-up. A journey from your favorite nerd. Relax, if you can. You know that moment when your ability to learn from your own mistakes just takes a vacation? A long, unpaid vacation, in some tax haven where your intelligence has fled? Yeah. I live in that state of permanent cerebral vacation. There I was, once again, on the sacred pilgrimage to my grandmother's basement. A sanctuary for dust mites, with a humidity that would make a frog feel at home and a smell that is a complex mixture of mothballs, regret, and, perhaps, a rat that passed away in 1987. The lighting, as always, was courtesy of a flashlight my grandfather probably used to look for dinosaurs. Its yellowish, trembling light created more scary shadows than it illuminated anything. It was the perfect setting for a very bad decision. And at the center of it all, on a pile of old gardening magazines, there it was. The book, Tempus Deviationum. The Latin title sounds fancy, but the loose translation is something like How to Ruin Your Timeline in 10 Easy Steps. My common sense, that annoying little voice that sometimes stops me from sticking a fork in an electrical socket, was screaming. Bellowing, actually. Ned, don't touch it. Turn around. Go watch a documentary. Eat a pint of ice cream. Do anything, you brainless redhead. But curiosity, for my brain, isn't a whisper. It's an addiction. Desperate for that drop of dopamine that only novelty brings, it ignored the voice of reason and focused on the one shiny, dangerous thing in the room. And like an idiot with a flawless track record of listening to the wrong impulse, I picked up the book. The cracked leather pages felt warm to the touch, or maybe it was just the stuffiness of the basement. They opened with that dry snap of old things, releasing a puff of dust that made me sneeze. And there it was. A new chapter. A new spell. A new opportunity to visit a place with no basic sanitation and a high probability of violent death. I read. Aloud. Because, apparently, my brain is a self-destruct button and I love to push it. In tempus bellorum et honoris, ubi ferum saltat et umbri silent. Feudal Japan. Oh, great. Samurai. I can barely handle a pair of chopsticks without poking myself in the eye, and now I'm going to a place where people use swords for everything. The usual whirlwind began. That feeling of being sucked down a cosmic drain. The characteristic sound of a goat laughing diabolically somewhere in the void, and I swear, one day I will find the source of that sound. And then, the impact. Bam! The transition is never smooth. It's not like in the movies, with an ethereal white light. It's more like being spat out by an interdimensional whale. The first thing I noticed was the smell. Damp earth, the intense, sweet perfume of flowers I didn't recognize, and the unmistakable aroma of wet wood and wood smoke. The air was heavy, thick with humidity, and I immediately felt my sweatshirt, my faithful companion in misery, start to cling to my skin. Excellent. Simply excellent. I opened my eyes, blinking to adjust to the light. I was lying face down on a kind of soft moss, surrounded by bamboo. Lots of bamboo. A sea of thin green stalks that rose toward the sky like the bars of a natural prison. The sound was a symphony of nature, the rustling of leaves in the wind, the buzzing of insects the size of small drones, and the distant croaking of frogs. It was peaceful, which, in my experience, is always the prelude to something terrible. I got up carefully, brushing the dirt from my jeans, which looked as out of place here as a penguin in the Sahara. My thick-soled sneakers sank slightly into the soft ground. Every movement seemed loud, a violation of the place's tranquility. I peeked through the bamboo stalks. About 50 yards away, I could see a clearing, and in it, a building. It wasn't an imposing castle like you see in the movies. It was a long, low residence, with dark, gracefully curved tile roofs that projected outward, creating shaded eaves. The walls were dark wood and rice paper panels, the famous shoji, which glowed softly with the light from within. Everything was elegantly asymmetrical, designed to harmonize with the landscape, not to dominate it. A Bukyashiki, the residence of a warrior family, of samurai. My historian brain went into automatic analysis mode, a defense mechanism to stop me from panicking completely. The wall surrounding the property wasn't high, made of mud and stone, with its own roof. There was an imposing main gate, but what caught my attention was the simplicity and order of the garden visible from my hiding spot. Carefully placed rocks, a small pond with an arched wooden bridge, and trees pruned with artistic precision. A Zen garden. A place for meditation and contemplation. A place to think about the impermanence of life before going out to, shorten someone else's. The irony was so thick you could almost cut it with a katana. I stayed there, crouching like a complete idiot, trying to process the situation. I was in feudal Japan. The specific period was an unknown, but the architecture and atmosphere screamed Sengoku Jidai, the Warring States period. A glorious era of about 150 years of constant civil war, betrayals, assassinations, and a political instability that made an afternoon on the stock market look like a yoga retreat. Fantastic. I had traded my stuffy basement for an entire nation in flames. What a great promotion! As my brain cataloged the risks, dysentery, plague, being mistaken for a foreign, fire-haired demon, being forcibly conscripted, being killed for looking at someone the wrong way, a sound cut through the air. It wasn't a sound of nature. It was a rhythmic swoosh, followed by a dull thud. Swoosh, thud. Swoosh, thud. Curiosity, that damn traitor, made me crawl closer, using the bamboo grove as cover. I reached the edge of the forest, with a clear view of a packed earth courtyard next to the main house. And that's where I saw her. My first impression was one of pure fluidity. It was a woman. She wasn't tall, but her posture exuded a contained strength that made her seem monumental. She wore a dark hakama, those wide, pleated trousers, and a simple gi, with the sleeves tied back to not interfere with her movements. Her black hair was tied in a tight, functional bun, And in her hands was a weapon that was both beautiful and terrifying. A naginata. A polearm with a long, curved blade at the tip, so sharp it seemed to cut the light itself. The weapon spun in her hands with a familiarity I usually only see in chefs dicing onions. Every movement was precise, economical, and deadly. The swoosh was the sound of the blade cutting the air. The thud was the base of the wooden staff striking a thick training post, marked by hundreds of other blows. She wasn't just exercising. She was dancing a choreography of death. Spins, thrusts, cuts, blocks. Her feet slid over the packed earth with a lightness that contradicted the lethality of her movements. Her face was impassive, a mask of absolute concentration. Her eyes focused on an invisible enemy. And there I was, a red-headed nerd with braces, hiding in the bushes, watching a woman who could slice me into 6 pieces before I could say, "Excuse me, ma'am, I seem to have taken a wrong turn at the time portal." This, my friends, was an Onimusha. A female warrior. And suddenly, fear gave way to something else. Hyperfocus. The bamboo, the danger, my own existence, everything vanished. There was only her and the naginata. Part of the Bushi class, the warrior nobility of Japan. I knew about them, of course. I had read about Tomo Guzan, the legendary 12th century warrior, so fierce she was described as a demon with a sword. But reading about something in a book, in the comfort of your air-conditioned room, is one thing. Seeing the reality embodied just a few feet away, wielding a weapon nearly 6 feet long, is another thing entirely. While most women of the samurai class were trained with the naginata for a primarily defensive purpose, to protect the home in the absence of men, somewhat far beyond. They fought in battles, led troops, and entered into folklore. The naginata was considered a particularly suitable weapon for women, as its reach allowed them to keep their distance from male opponents, who were usually stronger and heavier, neutralizing that advantage. It was the perfect equalizer. And in that woman's hands, it looked like an extension of her own body. Watching her, I began to understand the context that created a warrior like her. That Zen garden wasn't just for beauty. The paper house wasn't fragile by accident. Everything in that environment spoke of a philosophy, a way of life, but also of a brutal necessity. In an age of constant war, defense was not an option, it was a prerequisite for survival. When your husband, father, or brother left to fight for their daimyo, the feudal lord, the house and land didn't magically remain safe. Robbers, deserters, enemy armies, the threat could come from anywhere, at any time. The home was the last line of defense, and the women were its guardians. The warrior paused for a moment, the tip of her naginata resting on the ground. She took a deep breath, her chest rising and falling slowly. Vapor escaped her mouth in the cool morning air. Even from a distance, I could see the sweat glistening on her forehead. She wasn't a legend from a book. She was a real person, training with an exhausting dedication, driven by reasons I could only begin to imagine. She turned slightly, and my heart leaped. For a second, I thought she had seen me. My entire body froze. Hiding from a T-Rex was stressful, but at least it had vision based on movement. I wasn't so sure about the sensory skills of a trained samurai. But she wasn't looking at me. Her gaze was directed at a sliding door that opened slowly. A girl, maybe 7 or 8 years old, came out of the house. She was a miniature version of the woman, with the same black hair and serious eyes. She carried, with difficulty, a wooden naginata, clearly a training model. The girl walked to the woman and bowed deeply. The woman returned the gesture with an almost imperceptible nod. The warrior said something in Japanese. Thanks to the book's inexplicable magic, I understood perfectly. Her voice was calm, but firm as steel. Again. Your hip is unstable in the turn. You are not moving your weight, you are just swinging your arms. The strength comes from the earth, through your feet. Show me. The girl nodded, her face a small mask of determination. She tried to execute the move, a spin followed by a horizontal cut. It was clumsy. The wooden naginata swung wildly. The woman sighed, a tiny sound. She approached and, with a patience that seemed to contradict the deadly efficiency of her own movements, placed her hands on the girl's hips, guiding her, adjusting her posture. Feel the ground, she said, her voice a little softer now. Be the mountain, not the leaf in the wind. The leaf is carried away, the mountain remains. The strength is not in the blade, it is in you. The blade is just a voice. I was witnessing something incredibly intimate. I got so absorbed in the scene I made a rookie mistake. I moved. Just a small shift in weight, my sneakers slipping on a wet leaf. I forgot I had a body, that I was in a dangerous place. Time stopped making sense. And it was in that vacuum of self-awareness that I made a rookie mistake. I moved. Just a small shift in weight, my sneakers slipping on a wet leaf. The sound was minimal. A damp squish, almost inaudible. But to her, it was like thunder. In a fraction of a second, the woman turned. The naginata rose, its steel blade glinting in the morning sun, pointed directly at my hiding spot in the bamboo grove. The transition from patient mother to lethal sentinel was so fast, so absolute, it left me breathless. Her eyes, previously focused on the girl, now swept the treeline with an intensity that seemed to pierce every shadow, every leaf. The girl, seeing her mother's reaction, also turned, holding her small wooden spear like a shield. I wasn't breathing. My heart was pounding so hard I was sure they could hear it. My brain, the nerd supercomputer that was previously analyzing architecture and customs, now had only one message flashing in red neon: you are going to die. You are going to die. You are going to die. I was a deer in the headlights of a truck. A truck with a very, very sharp spear. Time, as you know, is relative. Einstein said so. But he never had a 6-foot spear, sharp enough to split an atom, pointed in his direction by a woman who was clearly in no mood to discuss theoretical physics. In that moment, for me, time stopped completely. Each second stretched into an eternity of pure, absolute, and paralyzing dread. My brain, that traitor that got me into this mess, decided it was the perfect time to flood me with useless information. Did you know that the blade of a naginata is made of multiple layers of folded steel, just like a katana? fascinating. Did you know that a well-placed strike can cut a man in half horizontally? Useful. Meanwhile, my body, on the other hand, opted for a more pragmatic approach, shutting down. I was frozen, a red-headed statue of terror, hidden behind some bamboo leaves that suddenly seemed as protective as a sheet of tissue paper. The warrior didn't move. Her eyes were like an eagle's, scrutinizing my precarious cover. The girl beside her, the little apprentice reaper of lives, mimicked her stance, holding her wooden naginata with a ferocity that was almost adorable, if it weren't so terrifying. I could see the tension in the woman's shoulders, the muscles coiled to spring forward. The silence was broken by the stupidest, most unexpected thing possible. My braces. In the middle of my panic, my mouth had gone as dry as the Atacama Desert. I swallowed, an involuntary movement, and the metal wire of my braces scraped against one of the brackets in a way that was particularly audible in the deadly silence. It made a small zing sound. A high-pitched, metallic, and completely alien sound in this world of wood, earth, and steel. The warrior's eyes narrowed. Her head tilted slightly. It was no longer a look of aggression, but of confusion. What was that sound? A strange bird? An exotic insect? A demon tuning his lute before dragging me to hell? Her expression changed from "I'm going to kill whatever is in there" to "what in the world was that noise?" Curiosity, it seems, is a universal force that can, occasionally, override the homicidal instinct. Seeing that slight hesitation, a part of my brain that was still functioning screamed, "Now, you idiot! Do something!" And what did I do? Did I fight? Did I scream? Did I try to communicate in archaic Japanese? No. I tripped. In a move that would have made any gym teacher weep with despair, I tried to back away silently and stepped on my own foot. The result was a spectacularly clumsy fall out of the bamboo grove, landing on my butt in the clearing, in full view of everyone. And there I was. The mysterious threat. A scrawny kid, with hair the color of a flaming carrot, wearing bizarre blue fabric pants, a sweatshirt with a hole in the elbow, and, most shocking of all, a gleaming, crooked, metal smile. I just sat there on the ground, blinking, looking less like a spy or an assassin and more like someone who had gotten lost on their way to a comic book convention. The warrior looked at me. She looked at her daughter. She looked back at me. The tip of her naginata lowered a few inches. The confusion on her face was now total. I didn't fit into any category she knew. I wasn't a wandering samurai, a ronin. I wasn't a peasant, my clothes were too strange. I wasn't a monk. And I definitely wasn't a ninja. I was an enigma. A pathetic, mud-covered enigma. The girl was the first to react. She pointed at my mouth and said a single word, her thin voice full of amazement. Hagane? Steel? She was asking if I had steel on my teeth. The mother looked closer, and her eyes widened slightly. Steel was a precious material, reserved for weapons and armor. The idea of someone having a mouthful of it was absurd. It was as if I had diamonds embedded in my fingernails. I, in my panicked state, could only do the one thing that seemed remotely sensible. I smiled. A wide, trembling, and completely idiotic smile, which made the sun glint off my braces. The warrior took a step back. Not in fear, but in sheer disbelief. She looked up at the sky, as if asking the gods for an explanation for the bizarre creature that had landed in her yard. I took my chance. With the agility of a snail with arthritis, I got up, keeping my hands in plain sight to show I had no weapons. I gave the most awkward and deep bow I could manage, almost hitting my head on the ground. I muttered Sumamason, sorry, sorry, repeatedly, my voice cracking. Then, without waiting for a response, I turned and ran. I ran like I had never run in my life. I didn't look back. I expected every second to feel the swoosh of the naginata followed by a sharp pain and the end of my miserable existence. But nothing came. Only the sound of my own feet crushing the undergrowth and my heart pounding like a war drum in my ears. I kept running, aimlessly, deeper and deeper into the forest. The terrain became uneven, climbing a gentle hill. I only stopped when my lungs felt like they were about to explode and my legs had turned to jelly. I leaned against a tree, panting, sweat pouring down my face. I was alive. And, apparently, being a clumsy nerd with a need for orthodontics was a surprisingly effective defense mechanism in feudal Japan. Who knew? When I finally caught my breath, I looked around. The forest was dense and ancient. Huge trees, their trunks covered in moss, formed a canopy that barely let the sunlight through. The air was cooler here. The silence was deep, broken only by the distant sound of a stream. I was completely lost. Excellent. I had traded an immediate, known danger for the possibility of starving to death, being eaten by a bear, or simply stumbling into a ravine. My resume of life decisions remained impeccable. I started walking, following the sound of the water. The logic was simple: where there's water, there's life. And where there's life, there are people. And where there are people, there is food. And, of course, more opportunities to get into trouble. But the alternative was to stay put and wait for the warrior woman to change her mind and come finish the job. I walked for what felt like hours. The sun began to set in the sky, filtering through the leaves in golden rays. The forest began to thin, and I started to see signs of civilization. Not the elegant, orderly civilization of the samurai estate, but something very different. The path ahead became more beaten. I saw trees that had clearly been cut by human hands. And then, I smelled something. Smoke, yes, but also the smell of many people together, of farm animals, and of something cooking. I stepped out of the tree line and what I saw was a shock. It was a village, but it didn't look like the peasant villages I had seen in woodblock prints. This one was fortified. A crude wooden palisade, with sharpened stakes pointing outward, surrounded the entire perimeter. There were makeshift watchtowers in each corner, and men with bamboo spears and simple bows patrolled the walls. They were not samurai. Their clothes were patched, their faces sunburnt and marked by hard labor. They were peasants. Farmers. But they moved with a purpose, with a grim determination. Hesitantly, I approached, keeping to the shadow of the trees. The village gate was open, and what I saw inside was a scene of organized chaos. Men were sharpening the tips of bamboo spears. Women were mending makeshift armor, made of leather and small metal plates. Monks with shaved heads, dressed in simple saffron-colored robes, moved among the groups, their calm but firm voices offering encouragement and instructions. There was a buzz of activity, a feverish energy that mixed fear, anger, and a strange kind of euphoria. And everywhere, there were banners. Simple flags, attached to bamboo poles, with a single calligraphed motto, Namu Amida Butsu. My historian brain, finally recovered from its panic, connected the dots. The palisade. The armed peasants. The warrior monks. The Buddhist banner. I had stumbled right into one of the most incredible and violent phenomena of the Sengoku period. I was looking at a stronghold of the Ikowiki. The literal translation is something like single-minded league or single-purpose riot. But that translation doesn't do them justice. The Ikowiki were one of the most disruptive forces in medieval Japan. They were a massive, decentralized coalition of believers of the Jodo Shinshu Buddhist sect, the true Pure Land sect. And what united them was not just faith, but a deep, visceral hatred of their samurai overlords. Think about it. For centuries, the social structure of Japan was as rigid as a katana. At the top, the emperor, a divine but powerless figure. Below him, the shogun, the military dictator. Then, the daimyo, the feudal lords who ruled their provinces like kings. And supporting all of this, the samurai class, the warriors who maintained order through force. And at the bottom, way at the bottom, crushed under the weight of the whole structure, were the peasants. They were 80% of the population, but they were treated as little more than livestock. They paid exorbitant taxes, were forcibly conscripted to fight in their lord's wars, and could be killed by a samurai for any offense, real or imagined. It was a life of labor, suffering, and humiliation. But then, something changed. The Jodo Shinshu sect, led by a charismatic monk named Renio, began to spread a radical message. A message that, to the peasants, sounded like pure salvation. The doctrine was simple: you don't need complicated rituals, years of meditation, or the intercession of an elite class of monks. All you need to reach the Pure Land, the Buddhist paradise, is sincere faith in the Amida Buddha. And the way to express that faith was to chant his name, Namu Amida Butsu. Seems simple, right? Harmless. But think of the implications. If salvation is available to everyone, regardless of social class, then the sacred hierarchy that placed samurai above peasants was a lie. If a farmer's faith was as valid as a daimyo's, then why did he have to bow down and hand over his harvest? Renio's message gave the peasants something they had never had: dignity. And with dignity came anger. And with anger came rebellion. The Ikowiki weren't just a disorganized mob. They were popular armies. Warrior monks, the Sohei, provided military leadership. Peasants, fed up with oppression, formed the infantry. And even low-ranking samurai and local nobles, discontented with their lords, joined the cause. They communicated through coded messages, mobilized quickly, and fought with the ferocity of those who believe that death in battle guarantees them a place in paradise. For a samurai, death was a matter of honor. For an Ikoiki warrior, it was a golden ticket to the afterlife. It's hard to fight an enemy who isn't afraid to die. And they had astounding success. They challenged and defeated samurai armies. They took castles. And in Kaga province, they did the unthinkable. They overthrew the samurai governor and ruled the province themselves. For almost 100 years, Kaga was the kingdom of the peasants. A theocratic popular republic in the middle of feudal Japan. It was an anomaly. A social heresy. And the feudal lords, like the infamous Oda Nobunaga, hated them with every fiber of their being. To them, the Ikoiki were not just enemies, they were a cancer that threatened to destroy the very order of the universe. And I was there, at the edge of the forest, watching one of these cancers preparing for chemotherapy, which in this case involved a lot of sharp spears. My initial fear of the warrior woman was replaced by a different kind of apprehension. The samurai estate was dangerous, but predictable. There were rules, a code of conduct. Here, in this rebel camp, the rules were different. The energy was raw, volatile. The samurai discipline was replaced by a religious fervor that could be both inspiring and terrifying at the same time. As I watched, a man climbed onto a cart in the center of the village. He was not a monk. He was a peasant, like the others, but there was an authority about him. His face was wrinkled, his hands were thick and calloused, but his eyes shone with a sharp intelligence. He raised his hands and the crowd fell silent. "Brothers! Sisters!" His voice was hoarse, but it resonated throughout the village. "The daimyo's intendant has sent a message. He demands 10% more of our rice to fund his useless war in the East. 10%! While our children go hungry." A roar of anger rose from the crowd. Fists were raised in the air. "They call us rabble. Rioters," the man continued. "They say we defy the order of heaven. But I ask you, what order is this, that allows wolves to wear silk while the sheep die of cold? What heaven is this, that blesses the tyrant's sword and ignores the farmer's prayers?" It was a powerful speech. Simple, direct, and devastatingly effective. He wasn't using complex rhetoric. He was giving voice to the pain and anger that everyone there felt. The Amida Buddha sees our suffering. His compassion is infinite, but our patience is not. They have their katanas, their horses, and their castles. And what do we have? He paused dramatically. The silence was total. "We have this," he shouted, and raised his fist. "Our faith. And we have this," and he pointed to the people around him. "Each other. A single stalk of bamboo breaks easily. But 1,000 stalks of bamboo together can build a fortress." The crowd exploded. The cry of Namo Amida Butsu echoed through the trees, no longer a whispered prayer, but a war cry. It was chilling. It was the sound of history being made, not by great men in audience chambers, but by common, dirty, desperate people who had decided they had had enough. I stood there, hidden, feeling incredibly small and irrelevant. I, the sarcastic 21st century nerd who complains when the internet is slow, was witnessing a moment of pure, raw revolution. It was easy to romanticize this from a distance, to see them as heroes fighting for freedom. But up close, the reality was more complex. I saw the hope in their faces, but I also saw the fear. I saw the courage, but also the blind fury that could consume everything in its path, including themselves. The war between the daimyo and the Ikuiki was one of the most brutal in Japan's history. Oda Nobunaga, the great unifier, spent years trying to crush them. In one of his most famous campaigns, he besieged their main fortress cathedral, Ishiyama Hongan-ji, for 10 years. When they finally surrendered, he burned the complex to the ground, killing tens of thousands of men, women, and children. There was no honor in this war. It was a fight of extermination. The samurai elite against a popular movement that threatened their divine right to rule. The leader on the cart got down and was immediately surrounded by others. They began to discuss in low voices, pointing to a map drawn in the dirt. They were planning something. An attack? A defense? I knew I couldn't stay there. If I were discovered, my fate was uncertain. To them, I was a gaijin, a foreigner. An outcast. At best, I would be ignored. At worst, I would be seen as a spy for the local daimyo. And I doubt they would care if my teeth were made of steel before they used me for target practice with their bamboo spears. I backed away slowly into the darkness of the forest, the sound of the chant Namo Amida Butsu following me like a ghost. Night was falling. The air was getting cold. I was alone, in the middle of a province at war, trapped between a warrior nobility that saw me as an aberration and an army of peasant fanatics who would probably see me as an enemy. My situation had gone from terrible to statistically hopeless. I found a small cave on the side of a hill, not much more than an indentation in the rock, but it was shelter. I curled up inside, shivering from cold and adrenaline. My stomach was growling. My only company was the sound of insects and the distant echo of a people preparing to fight for their souls. I closed my eyes, my brain buzzing with everything I had seen. The deadly discipline of the Onimusha. The desperate determination of the Ikuiki. They were two sides of the same bloody coin that was feudal Japan. A world of beauty and brutality, of rigid honor and chaotic rebellion. And I was stuck in the middle. Just my luck. At least, I thought with my last shred of sarcasm before passing out from sheer exhaustion, the rent was cheap. I don't know if you've ever had the pleasure of sleeping in a cave, but I don't recommend it. It's an experience that combines the joy of having rocks jab you in places you didn't know you had, with the damp cold that seeps into your bones and the constant paranoia that some furry animal with too many teeth will decide you make an excellent midnight snack. Sleep wasn't rest, it was a series of small blackouts from exhaustion, interrupted by every snapped twig or distant howl. I woke with the first gray light of day filtering into my stone shelter. My body felt like it had been used as a punching bag by a group of ogres. Every muscle ached. My neck was so stiff I suspected I would only be able to look to the left for the rest of my life. And the hunger was a living creature inside me, gnawing at my stomach with an impressive fervor. The first order of business, food. The second, not dying. Usually, one depends on the other. My best and only option was the Ikuiki village. Yes, a camp of fanatical religious rebels. What a wonderful choice. But they had food. And where there is chaos and fervor, there is often carelessness. My plan was as simple as it was stupid: crawl over there, take advantage of the changing of the guards or some other distraction, steal something edible, and disappear before anyone decided to test my devotion to the Amida Buddha. I left the cave, shivering, and started down the slope towards the village. The morning air was crisp and clean, smelling of pine and wet earth. I moved with the grace of a refrigerator falling down the stairs, each step a concert of snapped branches and crushed leaves. I would make a terrible thief. When I neared the palisade, I crouched behind a particularly dense bush. The camp was beginning to wake up. I saw women lighting fires, smoke rising in lazy columns into the pale sky. The lookouts on the towers yawned and stretched. The feverish energy of the previous night had given way to a slow morning routine. Perfect. My target was an area at the back of the village where they seemed to store provisions. There were sacks of rice, baskets of vegetables, and, if my luck was about to change drastically, maybe even some fruit. The problem was crossing about 100 feet of open ground between the tree-line and the back of a hut. I waited, observing the patterns. A guard came down from the tower to get a bowl of water. 2 others were talking, their bamboo spears leaning against the palisade. No one was looking in my direction. It was now or never. I took a deep breath and prepared for the most stealthy and pathetic sprint in the history of espionage. And it was at that exact moment, as I was focused on the guards and the food, that I noticed something wrong. It wasn't a sound. It was the absence of one. There was a section of the palisade, to my right, that was plunged in deep shadow. One of the guards patrolling that section had stopped. He was leaning against one of the wooden posts, his head hung forward, as if he had fallen asleep standing up. But there was something terribly still about his posture. As I watched him, a piece of the shadow near him detached itself. It made no noise. There was no sudden movement. It was as if a piece of the darkness had become solid and simply glided. A figure, so dark and shapeless it barely registered in my peripheral vision, moved from the base of the palisade to the wall of a nearby hut. The figure was short, dressed not in the black silk pajamas of the movies, but in the dark brown and gray clothes of a peasant, the colors of the earth, of the night, and of shadows. Its head was covered by a hood that completely concealed its face. The figure moved with an economy of motion that made yesterday's Onimusha look like a disco dancer. Every step was deliberate, silent, placed in exactly the right spot so as not to disturb a single pebble. It was less a human walking and more a stream of water finding the path of least resistance. The sleeping guard? I realized then that he wasn't sleeping. From the base of his neck, a tiny dark stain was beginning to spread across his collar. There was no struggle, no cry. Just silence. My blood ran cold. I forgot the hunger, the cold, my stupid plan. I was witnessing a professional at work. And not the kind of professional who wields a spear and shouts a war cry. This was a different kind of warrior. One who thrived where the samurai failed, in dishonor, deception, and silence. I was looking at a shinobi. A ninja. And everything I thought I knew about them, learned from action movies and video games, crumbled in that instant. There were no shiny throwing stars, no colored smoke bombs, no impossible acrobatics. There was only a cold, terrifying efficiency. My brain, always my brain, began to download the correct file, overriding the Hollywood fiction. The shinobi, or ninjas, as the West has popularized them, were not a social class like the samurai. They were mercenaries. Specialists. They were the pragmatic answer to a question that the samurai class, with its rigid code of honor, Bushido, could not answer. How do you win a war when the rules of honor prevent you from doing what is necessary? Bushido was great for duels and pitched battles. It spoke of courage, loyalty, and facing the enemy head-on. But it had no answer for espionage, sabotage, or assassination. These were tactics considered dirty, unworthy of an honorable warrior. But they were effective. And in a country plunged into a century-long civil war, effectiveness often trumped honor. And so, the daimyo, the same samurai lords who publicly disdained such methods, secretly hired specialized clans to do their dirty work. Clans from places like Iga and Koga, mountainous and hard-to-reach provinces, where generations of families developed a unique set of skills, ninjutsu. It wasn't magic. It was a brutally practical curriculum of survival and unconventional warfare. They learned to move silently, to scale walls, to use disguises. They were masters of psychology, exploiting the superstitions and fears of their enemies. They learned to use poisons, explosives, and a variety of discreet and effective weapons. Their greatest weapon was not the sword. It was information. A successful shinobi could infiltrate an enemy castle disguised as a servant, spend weeks listening to conversations, mapping defenses, and identifying weaknesses, and then disappear, leaving behind a detailed report that was worth more than 1,000 soldiers. Or, as I was witnessing, they could enter a camp, eliminate a specific target, and leave, sowing chaos and paranoia. The figure glided along the hut wall, a patch of darkness moving against the dark wood. It reached the village well, the center of community life. The sun was rising higher now, and people were beginning to move with more purpose. A woman approached the well with 2 wooden buckets. The shinobi didn't move. It merged with the shadow of a nearby cart, becoming completely invisible. Its patience was inhuman. It was in no hurry. It was part of the environment. The woman drew a bucket of water, filled her containers, and left. Then another came. And another. The well was a meeting point. The shinobi waited. Its target wasn't the water itself, at least not yet. It was observing, learning, waiting for its opportunity. And then I saw its true objective. Last night's leader, the charismatic peasant who had inflamed the crowd, came out of one of the larger huts. He was talking with one of the warrior monks. They walked together, passing just a few feet from the well. The shinobi still didn't move. It waited for them to stop, to become engaged in a discussion about the map they were drawing in the dirt. Several others joined them, forming a small circle. Everyone's attention was focused on the ground. Now, with a movement so fast and subtle I almost missed it, the shinobi slid from its shadow. It didn't go towards the group. It went towards the well. In its hand, something small and dull. a small cloth pouch. It uncovered the well, opened the pouch, and emptied the contents into the water. There was no big splash. The powder dissolved silently, disappearing into the dark water. Then, it replaced the wooden lid and, with the same fluid speed, slid back into the shadow. The entire operation took less than 5 seconds. Poison. It wasn't a fast-acting poison that would make people drop dead on the spot. That would be too obvious. It was, probably, something slower. A poison that would cause sickness, cramps, weakness. Something that, in a few days, would incapacitate half the village. A victory without a single battle. Dishonorable? Absolutely. Effective? Genius, in its brutality. The local daimyo didn't need to defeat the Ikoiki army if he could simply turn it into a field hospital. The irony of the situation was overwhelming. Here was an army of religious rebels, considered impure and heretical by the warrior class, being attacked by an agent whose very existence was a negation of the honor code of that same class. It was a cycle of hypocrisy and violence, and I had a front row seat. The shinobi wasn't finished. Sabotage was only the first part. It began to move again, circling the village from the inside, always using the shadows, the terrain, the complacency of its victims. Its next target was a granary where they kept a large portion of the rice. It reached the back wall, took out a small tool, and began to work on the wood, creating a hole. I was completely mesmerized. My own danger had been forgotten. I, the historian, was watching a practical lesson. This was ninjutsu in action. It wasn't about combat, it was about strategy. Destroy morale, poison resources, eliminate leadership. They were the 3 pillars of guerrilla warfare, practiced centuries before Che Guevara was even born. Suddenly, chaos. From the other side of the village, far from where the shinobi was, one of the watchtowers burst into flames. A cry rang out. It was a diversion. A brilliant distraction. While everyone ran to put out the fire, the real work was being done elsewhere. In the midst of the confusion, the peasant leader, who was still discussing his map, turned to shout orders. At that moment, an arrow, fired from an impossible angle from the roof of a hut, shot through the air. It made almost no sound. It hit the leader in the throat. He grabbed his neck, his eyes wide with surprise, a gurgling sound escaping his mouth. He fell to his knees and then forward, dead before he hit the ground. The chaos turned into panic. The monk beside him shouted, pointing at the roof. But there was no one there. The shinobi, having fired its arrow, had already vanished, probably slipping down the back of the roof and melting into the panicking crowd. The entire village was now a kicked anthill. The leader was dead, a tower was on fire, and, unbeknownst to anyone yet, their water supply was poisoned. In less than half an hour, a single person had decapitated and crippled the entire rebellion. And me? I saw my chance. In the midst of the panic, no one cared about the provisions. I ran, finally, from my hiding place. My heart was pounding uncontrollably, but now it was from adrenaline, not fear. I reached the storage area, grabbed a small bag of rice and a handful of dried turnips. It wasn't a feast, but it was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen. No one saw me. No one cared. They were too busy shouting, running with buckets of water from the poison well. The irony was tragic, and staring at their fallen leader. I grabbed my loot and fled. I ran in the opposite direction from the warrior woman, deep into the forest. I didn't stop until the village was just a memory and the screams a distant echo. I found a stream, thank God, not a well, and drank until I couldn't anymore. I washed the turnips and ate them raw. They tasted like victory. The most pathetic, opportunistic victory ever. I sat there, with my little bag of rice, trembling, processing what I had just witnessed. I had seen the 3 pillars of warfare in the Sengoku period in less than 24 hours. The elite warrior, personifying the honor and discipline of Bushido. The popular revolt, fueled by faith and desperation. And the invisible hand of the spy, the silent weapon that operated in the shadows where honor could not go. They were 3 worlds, all colliding. And I belonged to none of them. I was an observer, a ghost from another time, watching history unfold in the dirtiest, most complicated way possible. My respect for ninjas increased tenfold. And my fear, too. They weren't monsters. They were the logical product of an illogical era. They were proof that, in war, the only rule is that there are no rules. I felt a little safer, now that I had food and was away from the immediate danger. But I also felt more alone than ever. I had just seen a man be assassinated, a community be condemned. My usual sarcasm felt like a very thin shield against the brutality of what was real. I took a deep breath. I had survived another day. That would have to be enough for now. I looked at my small bag of rice. It would have to last. And I would have to find a way out of this hellish century. But first, a little more rest. Far from warriors, rebels, and especially, from moving shadows. There's a certain clarity that only hunger and fear can provide. A sort of pocket philosophy for one's personal apocalypse. After eating 3 raw turnips that had the texture of wood and a vaguely earthy taste, and drinking water from a stream that I fervently hoped had not been recently visited by a ninja with a little bag of spices, I found a new state of mind. It was a state that was situated somewhere between resignation and pure stubbornness. The adrenaline of the escape and theft had dissipated, leaving behind a deep, existential weariness. I had survived. Great. Now what? My grand strategy of run for the hills was revealing its flaws. I needed a plan that went beyond the next 5 minutes. I found refuge in an abandoned hunter's cabin. It was little more than a pile of planks conspiring to become a pile of wood again, but it had a roof, mostly, and 4 walls, sort of. It was my palace. And it was there that I made a monumental decision. I was going to cook my rice. I know what you're thinking. Ned, you're in the middle of feudal Japan, surrounded by mortal dangers, and your great epiphany is to cook? Yes. Because cooking that rice wasn't just about food. It was an act of defiance. It was me saying to the universe, to this brutal and indifferent century, you can try to kill me with samurai, rebels, and silent assassins, but tonight, I, Ned, the red-headed nerd, am going to eat a hot carbohydrate. I made a tiny fire inside the cabin, using my limited Boy Scout skills, which consisted mainly of remembering a video I saw once. I used half a coconut I found on the ground as a makeshift pot. It was the most pathetic and, at the same time, most glorious meal of my life. Every grain of soft rice was a victory. As I ate, my mind began to organize the events of the last 24 hours. It wasn't just a series of unfortunate accidents. It was an ecosystem. A life cycle, or rather, a death cycle. First, I saw the animasha, the apex predator, the personification of order, discipline, and the power of the ruling class. She represented the structure, the pinnacle of a social pyramid built with steel and blood. Her honor, her bushido, was the operating system of that society. A code that dictated who lived, who died, and why it was perfectly acceptable to slice up a clumsy stranger who fell out of the bamboo. She was order. Then, I saw the Ikoiki, the stampeding herd. They were the inevitable reaction to that order. The chaotic force of the masses, the power of those with nothing to lose. Their faith was their weapon, a force that turned farmers into martyrs and villages into fortresses. They were the antithesis of the samurai, disorganized, passionate, driven not by a code of honor, but by a dream of salvation and a desire for revenge. They were disorder. And finally, the shinobi, the scavenger, the parasite, the agent of chaos who belongs to neither side and, at the same time, serves them both. He didn't operate according to the honor of the samurai or the faith of the rebels. His code was effectiveness. His god was the result. He was entropy made man, exploiting the weaknesses of both systems, accelerating the decay. He was the silent catalyst that turned a tense standoff into a massacre. Order, disorder, and the agent who profits from both. I had witnessed the thesis, antithesis, and horrifying synthesis of war in this period. And the end result, I suspected, was never pretty. I spent the rest of the day in the cabin, sleeping a heavy, dreamless sleep. When I woke the next day, I felt almost human. The pain had subsided, the hunger was sated for now. But a new feeling took its place, a profound loneliness. I was an observer, yes, but being a ghost at a party is one thing. Being a ghost at a slaughterhouse is another thing entirely. The need to go home, to find that damn book, became a physical ache. I knew I couldn't stay in the cabin forever. I needed to move, but where? Going back was not an option. The only direction was forward. I decided to follow the stream, hoping it would lead me to a road, to a larger village, to somewhere I could, perhaps, disappear into a crowd. After a few hours of walking, the forest began to give way to fields. But they weren't the well-tended rice paddies I had expected. They were abandoned, the rice rotting on the stalks. Further ahead, I saw smoke. Not the healthy smoke of hearths, but the black, greasy smoke of something burning that shouldn't be. The smell of ash and something else, something metallic and sickly, hung in the air. My stomach turned. I approached with a caution born of recent trauma. I reached a small rise and looked down. The scene was final. It was a small dirt road that ran through a field. And that road was covered with bodies. Men dressed in the patched clothes of the Ikoiki lay at awkward angles, their bamboo spears broken beside them. Mixed in with them were bodies in light armor. A shigeru, the samurai infantry, probably part of a patrol. The battle had been short and brutal. The grass was stained red and trampled. A rebel banner, with the Namo Amida Butsu, lay in the mud, partially burned. This was the result. The direct consequence of what I had witnessed. The shinobi had decapitated the rebel leadership and sown panic. His diversion, the burning tower, had likely alerted a samurai patrol in the area. The rebels, disorganized and panicking, had probably tried to flee or mount a hasty defense. And they were slaughtered. The shinobi didn't even have to dirty his own sword. His true weapon was causality. I went down the hill, moving among the dead. The silence was heavy, punctuated only by the buzzing of flies. I looked at the face of a dead peasant. He was young, maybe my age. His mouth was open in a silent scream, his eyes staring at the gray sky. He had fought for a paradise, for dignity, and he ended up here, rotting in an anonymous field. His faith had not saved him. A few feet away was an Ashigaru. His cheap armor was dented, his spear broken in his chest. He was also young. He didn't fight for faith, but for duty. Or for a meager salary and a bowl of rice. His code of honor, a diluted version of his superior's Bushido, required him to kill and die for his lord. And he had fulfilled his part of the bargain. Honor and faith. Two sides of the same stupid coin. Both dead in the same mud. Seeing this up close, smelling the blood and death, removes any romanticism that history might have. There is no glory here. Only waste. I felt a wave of nausea. This wasn't a documentary. These were people. People with families, with hopes, however small. And I had eaten turnips while the catalyst of their deaths unfolded. Spectators' guilt is a strange thing. Useless, but heavy. I was preparing to walk away, to leave this monument to human futility behind, when I heard a sound. A moan. It came from a pile of bodies near a tree. I hesitated. My first rule was don't get involved. Involvement leads to complications. And complications, in this century, usually ended with more bodies in the mud. But the sound repeated. It was weak, full of pain. Damn my conscience. I approached slowly. Hello? I said, my voice a hoarse whisper. Stupid. What was I expecting? An invitation for tea? I pushed a body aside and saw him. He was a boy, not much older than the girl I had seen training with the naginata. Maybe 13, 14. He wore the clothes of a peasant and had a nasty wound on his leg, a spear wound that was bleeding slowly. He was one of the Ikoiki. A boy soldier. His eyes open and fixed on me. There was panic in them. He tried to crawl backward, but cried out in pain. Easy, easy, I said, holding up my hands. I'm not going to hurt you. He looked at my hair, at my clothes, at my face. Confusion wrestled with fear in his eyes. Bakemono, he whispered. Monster. Demon. No, I'm not a demon, I sighed. Believe me, my life would be a lot easier if I were. I moved closer and tore a piece from the hem of my sweatshirt. It wasn't much, but it was clean. I knelt beside him. Let me see that. He flinched, but he had no strength to fight. I cleaned the blood as best I could and tied the cloth around the wound. It was a pathetic bandage, but maybe it would slow the bleeding. He watched me, his breathing shallow. Who are you? I'm just a lost traveler, I said. It was the simplest truth. What happened here? Samurai, he spat the word like poison. They came from nowhere. Our leader, someone killed him. We were confused, we tried to fight. He looked around at his dead comrades, and his eyes filled with tears. Everyone's gone. Master Renio says they are in the Pure Land now. And do you believe that? I asked, more gently than I intended. He looked at me, and for the first time, I saw doubt crack his fanatical faith. I don't know, he admitted, his voice breaking. It hurts. If this is the path to the Pure Land, why does it hurt so much? That question hit me harder than any spear. There it was. The crack in the armor of ideology. The painful collision between the promise of eternal glory and the dirty reality of an infected wound. Because the body wants to live, I answered softly. Even when the mind tells it to die. He was silent, absorbing that. They killed my father yesterday, he said, his voice flat. And my brother. I was the only one left. I felt a tightness in my chest. This kid had lost everything for a cause he was only beginning to understand. And for nothing. You have to get out of here, I told him. When the samurai come back to collect their dead, they won't leave any survivors. I can't walk, he said, desperation creeping back into his voice. I looked around. I couldn't carry him. I could barely carry myself and my precious bag of rice. But I couldn't leave him there. I looked at the tree he was lying near. Its branches were low and thick. Can you climb? I asked. If I help you get to that tree, can you hide in the branches until they're gone? He looked at the tree, sizing it up. He nodded slowly. I think so. With a lot of effort and a lot of pained groans, mostly his, some mine, I managed to help him up. He leaned on me as we limped to the tree. I was able to give him a boost and he grabbed onto a branch, hoisting himself up with the strength of his arms. He found a spot where the branches and leaves formed a dense hiding place and disappeared from view. Thank you, I heard his voice whisper from above. Stay quiet and don't make a sound, I said. Good luck. I gave him one of my turnips and a little of my cooked rice, wrapped in a leaf. It was almost everything I had. But in that moment, it seemed like the only thing to do. I walked away from the field of death, feeling emptier than before. My interaction with the boy had broken my observer shell. I was no longer a ghost. I had interfered. A small interference, but an interference nonetheless. I had given him a small chance to survive. And in doing so, I had taken on a small part of his burden. The need to find the book became overwhelming. This wasn't a history lesson. It was a nightmare, and I wanted to wake up. There had to be a logic to the book's appearance. It couldn't just leave me here forever. There had to be a trigger, a pattern. I kept walking, my brain working furiously. I looked at the horizon. In the distance, far in the distance, I could see the roofs of a larger city, nestled at the foot of a mountain. A city meant more people, more places to hide, but also more samurai, more rules, more dangers. But maybe, just maybe, in a place with more people and more history, I would have a better chance of finding my ticket out. With a new, albeit desperate, purpose, I began to walk towards the distant city. Each step was an effort, but it was a step with a direction. I was no longer a lost traveler. I was a man on a mission. The nerdiest, most selfish mission of all time, to find a magic book so I could go back home, to my couch, and to my 21st century problems, which suddenly seemed wonderfully trivial. There is a fundamental difference between being lost in the forest and being lost on a road. In the forest, your main concern is nature trying to kill you. On a road, nature gives way to a much more unpredictable and, in my opinion, much more annoying danger, other people. The walk towards the distant city was a lesson in feudal sociology in motion. The dirt road became wider and more frequented. I passed pilgrims in straw sandals, their white clothes standing out against the green landscape, murmuring prayers as they walked. I passed merchants leading stubborn mules laden with pottery, fabrics, and God knows what else, their faces a mask of distrust towards everyone they met. I saw a tax collector with 2 samurai bodyguards, his smug expression making me wish I had a rotten tomato on hand. I, of course, was an anomaly. My red hair drew stares. My modern clothes drew even more. I quickly learned to keep my head down, to walk with a hurried pace, and to avoid eye contact, trying to project the aura of "please don't kill me, I'm just having a very bad day" that has now lasted for several centuries. My small bag of rice was almost empty, and hunger was once again becoming a constant companion. My only consolation was that, with the dirt, sweat, and general despair, I probably looked less like an alien demon and more like a crazy beggar, which was a slight upgrade on the local social scale. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I arrived. The city was nestled at the base of a mountain, and at the top of that mountain, dominating the landscape, was a castle. A real Japanese castle, with its sloping stone walls and its multiple white roofs rising towards the sky. It was a jokamachi, a castle town, the nerve center of the local daimyo's power. Entering the city was an assault on the senses. A massive wooden gate opened onto a narrow, crowded street. The noise was deafening, the shouts of vendors, the hammering of a blacksmith, the barking of dogs, the crying of children, all mixed into an overwhelming cacophony. And the smell, the smell. It was a complex mixture of frying food, incense, open sewers, crowd sweat, and raw fish. It was the perfume of humanity before the invention of basic sanitation, and it was awful. I had to lean against a wall for a moment, trying not to be swept away by the human tide. And as I stood there, watching the city life unfold, I saw everything. I saw the themes of my misadventure all dancing together in this urban soup. Patrols of samurai, with their 2 swords at their waists and an arrogance that could cut glass, walked down the street as if they owned it, which, technically, they did. They were the order, the visible structure of power, ensuring that no one stepped out of line. Their cold gazes passed over the heads of the commoners, indifferent. I saw Buddhist monks begging for alms, their bowls outstretched, their shaved heads shining in the sun. People gave them coins and food with a genuine reverence. They were a reminder of the deep faith that permeated everything, the same faith that, just a few miles away, had fueled a bloody rebellion. Here in the city, faith was peaceful, domesticated. But its latent energy was there. And in a tea house, as I passed by, I heard 2 merchants whispering. Their heads were together, their voices low. I heard the words assassination and tax and IGA province. They were the echoes of the shadow world, proof that even in the heart of the daimyo's power, the invisible hand of the shinobi was still moving, pulling the strings, influencing politics and commerce through methods no one would admit to in public. Order, faith, and secrets. It was all here, coexisting in a tense, smelly balance. But I wasn't here for sociological tourism. I was on a mission. The book. Where, in a place like this, could a magical time-traveling book decide to appear? My nerd logic pointed to a single type of place, a place of knowledge. Of records. A place where a strange, old book wouldn't look completely out of place. A temple. I raised my eyes and saw, beyond the roofs of the shops and houses, the elaborate roof of a large Buddhist temple complex. It was my best guess. Crossing the city was an ordeal. I was pushed, cursed at, and almost run over by a cart. Finally, I reached the temple gates. Here, the air was different. The noise of the street was muffled. The smell of sewage was replaced by the scent of old pine trees and sandalwood incense. It was an oasis of calm in the midst of chaos. I entered. The complex was vast, with several buildings connected by covered wooden walkways. Gardens of stone and sand, perfectly raked, invited meditation. I didn't want to meditate. I wanted my bed and a pizza. I wandered aimlessly for a while, feeling completely out of place. I saw monks sweeping fallen leaves with infinite patience. I saw noblemen praying in the main hall. No one paid any attention to me. I was just another lost soul searching for something. It was then that I saw it. A smaller building, set back from the main halls. It looked older, more neglected. The plaque above the door was worn, but I could make out the kanji for archive or library. My heart sped up. This was it. It had to be. The door creaked as I opened it. The interior was dark and dusty. The air was heavy with the smell of old paper and mildew, a smell that, for the first time in my life, felt like the smell of home. Tall, crowded shelves of scrolls and manuscripts filled the room. Light entered through a single window with a wooden lattice, illuminating dust particles dancing in the air. And there it was. On a low reading table in the center of the room. Alone. As if an invisible librarian had left it there for me. Temps deviationem. The dark leather. The brass clasp. It looked perfectly normal and, at the same time, the most miraculous thing I had ever seen. I approached slowly, afraid it was a mirage. I touched the cover. It was real. I felt a wave of relief so powerful my legs buckled and I had to lean on the table. I grabbed the book. I hugged it as if it were a long-lost relative. For a moment, I thought about sitting right there and reading the return spell. But no! I knew the rules. The trip was unstable, loud, and flashy. Doing it in the middle of a temple complex was a terrible idea. I needed a secluded spot. I left the library, hiding the book under my tattered sweatshirt. My heart was pounding, but this time it was with excitement. I crossed the temple courtyards, went out into the noisy street, and began to retrace my steps out of the city. Every step was lighter than the last. I was going home. I found what I needed in a small grove on the outskirts of the city. A quiet place, where the only sound was the wind in the trees. I sat on the ground, my back against a tree, and placed the book in my lap. I opened it. The pages flipped on their own, as if impatient, passing by spells for ancient Rome, for pharaonic Egypt, until they stopped on a blank page. And then, the words began to appear, the ink forming from nothing. They were in Latin, as always, but their meaning was clear: return ticket. I hesitated for an instant. I looked through the trees, at the distant roofs of the castle. I thought of the Onimusha, her deadly discipline and her dedication to her daughter. I thought of the Ikoiki boy I helped, his broken faith and his fear. I thought of the shinobi, a lethal shadow serving a cause that wasn't even his own. It was, without a doubt, the worst trip of my life. I was hunted, I starved, I was terrified, and I saw more death and suffering than I ever wanted to see. But I had seen. I had understood something about honor, faith, and the brutality of survival in a way that no history book could have ever taught me. And, as strange as it sounds, I felt a pang of respect. For all of them. For their resilience in this impossible world. It was an uncomfortable feeling. Enough sentimentalism, Ned, I said aloud. It's time to go home and take a shower that lasts for 3 days. I took a deep breath, placed my finger on the first word of the spell, and began to read aloud. Ex umbra et ferro, ex fide et silentio, redditus ad originem. The world began to dissolve. The familiar whirlwind of colors and sounds began to suck me in. The air smelled of ozone and dust. And, of course, there it was, the faint but unmistakable sound of a goat laughing at my misfortune. Goodbye, feudal Japan. I will not miss you. Bam! The impact. The disorientation. And the smell. Mothballs. Mildew. And the ghost of a deceased rat. I was back. Lying on my back on the cold concrete floor of my grandmother's basement. The dim light of the solitary bulb swayed above me. The book lay beside me, closed, its leather cover as innocent as a photo album. I stood up, my body aching in a way that only time travel can achieve. My clothes were dirty and torn. I smelled of smoke, sweat, and 16th century despair. But I was home. I went up the stairs, opened the door, and was greeted by the sound of my grandmother's television and the smell of her Sunday roast. Never in my life had a sound and a smell seemed so heavenly. And so ends another of my unsolicited vacations into the past. A little excursion to feudal Japan, courtesy of my cursed travel book. I learned a lot. Mostly that I am not built for a life without antibiotics and high-speed internet. The next time you feel stressed because your food delivery is late, remember Ned. Remember that, somewhere in the past, people were dealing with plagues, famines, and the very real possibility of being sliced in half for forgetting to bow. Suddenly, our modern problems seem quite manageable. And that's today's lesson, straight from the worst eras in history. Life is hard. But it could be much, much worse. Now, take a deep breath. Relax your shoulders. Your biggest battle today will probably be deciding what to watch next on Netflix. And that, my friends, is a privilege worth being grateful for. I'm Ned. And this has been another Bad Moments. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have a date with a shower and about 12 cheeseburgers. Sleep well. You deserve it.